Her coat was still draped across the back of the chair when they found it. Not dropped, not thrown. Folded neatly across the back of the wood-framed chair, the way someone might leave it if they expected to return in an hour. A dark wool coat with a broken button on the right cuff that she had been meaning to replace since September. It was a Friday in October in the town of Belhaven, New Hampshire, population 2,212. The maples had turned to copper, and the air had gone cold enough that you could see your breath in the parking lot of Millbrook Elementary School. At 6:30 that evening, a teacher named Patricia Marsh came back for a forgotten lesson planner and found every light in room 14 still burning. Grade papers were spread across the desk in a careful stack. A steel thermos, half finished, sat beside them. The coat hung where it always hung. Margaret Coburn was not there. She was never there again. What happened in the space of those 90 minutes, between 6 o'clock on October 14th, 1983, and the moment Patricia Marsh reached through that classroom doorway and understood something was wrong, would haunt Belhaven for 41 years. It would hollow out one family completely. It would sit in a steel evidence locker through 3 decades of technological revolution, waiting for a science that did not yet exist to finally come looking for it. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the woman who taught 3rd grade as if it was the most important work in the world. Because to understand what was lost that October, you first have to understand who Margaret Coburn was. Belhaven, in 1983, was the kind of New Hampshire town that felt like a promise kept. The main street had a hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, and a post office. Children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Neighbors left keys under doormats, and nobody thought twice about it. The world had not yet taught this town to be afraid. Margaret, Maggie to everyone who knew her, was 34 years old that fall. She'd grown up 40 minutes north in Laconia, married Philip Coburn in 1974, and moved to Belhaven when Philip took over his father's hardware store on Route 3. They had 2 boys. Daniel was 9, Christopher was 7. On weekend mornings, a small television on the kitchen counter played Reagan's weekly radio address while the boys ate cereal and Maggie packed her school bag on the kitchen table. On Saturdays, the 4 of them raked leaves in a yard so wide it took most of an afternoon to clear. And she always found a way to make the pile worth jumping into before the work was done. She had been teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook for 6 years. She was known for staying until the last question was answered, for leaving notes on returned papers in handwriting that her students kept. She grew tomatoes in the raised beds behind the house every summer, and when the harvest came in heavy, she filled baskets and left them on neighbors' porches before sunrise, so the gift wouldn't require anyone to say thank you. Her colleagues had a running joke that her classroom smelled like books and whatever was growing in her garden that week. She was 2 credits from finishing her master's degree in education at UNH. She drove down on Tuesday evenings, and her sister Carol had started teasing her about what she'd do when she ran out of degrees to earn. Her plan was to move into curriculum design, to help other teachers do what she already knew how to do. The era-specific markers of 1983 Belhaven anchored her life in small ways. The Coburns had an answering machine that Philip had bought at a Radio Shack in Concord. Daniel had an Atari in his room. A station wagon sat in the driveway, rust beginning at the bottom of the driver's side door. On Friday evenings, after Maggie got home from school, they often drove to the video rental place on Route 3, which had just opened that summer. And the boys were each allowed to pick 1 tape. That was the family Philip Coburn had. That was what he had to account for every morning when he woke up. The last morning he would ever feel it whole was a Friday in October that smelled like wood smoke and dying leaves. He kissed his wife goodbye in the kitchen at 7:45, reminded Daniel about his book report, and watched her back the car out of the driveway. He would not see her again. The day at Millbrook passed in its ordinary way. Maggie's third graders had a reading comprehension test in the morning. 2 of them needed her at lunch, working through words that wouldn't stay in place on the page. In the early afternoon, the hallway floors got their weekly buffing. The custodian's cart moving slowly between the rows of lockers, the hum of the machine working back and forth before disappearing around the corner toward the gym. At 3:15, the last bus pulled out of the Circle Drive and the building began to empty. Most of the staff was gone by 4 o'clock. Maggie stayed the way she always did on Fridays. She had 22 reading tests to grade and had told Philip she would be home by 6:30. At 5:58, a teacher named Dennis Fahey passed the open door of her classroom on his way out and paused. She looked up. She smiled. She said she had about 20 minutes left. He waved. He pushed through the rear door of the building and drove home. Those 14 words were the last confirmed exchange anyone had with Margaret Coburn. By 6:45, Philip called the school. The phone rang in an empty hallway. He waited, set the receiver down, and told himself she was in the bathroom, that she had stepped out for a moment. At 7:15, he loaded the boys into the station wagon and drove to Millbrook. He found her car in the parking lot, engine cold. He went inside through the unlocked front entrance. Every light in room 14 was still burning. The thermos, the graded papers, stacked, the coat on the chair. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he walked to the front office and used the phone. His call to the Belhaven Police Department was logged at 7:31 p.m. The next 48 hours moved the way these things move. 2 officers at the scene by 8. The principal reached at home by 9. Search teams at the property line by midnight. In the soft ground near the rear fire exit, searchers recovered a single boot print, men's, approximate size 11, partially destroyed by the rain that had come through around 9 that evening. On the wooden post of the perimeter fence at the back of the school grounds, investigators found a small tuft of dark fabric fiber caught in a splinter. On Sunday morning, October 16th, a family hiking the South Trail around Belhaven Lake found Margaret Coburn in the tree line at the water's edge, 3/10 of a mile from the school parking lot. She had been deceased for approximately 36 hours. During the medical examiner's examination, investigators recovered a biological sample from beneath the fingernails of her right hand. That sample would sit in a Merrimack County evidence locker for the next 4 decades. She was 34 years old. She was 2 credits from a graduate degree. She had tomatoes still on the vine at home that nobody had gotten around to picking. Detective Sergeant Leo Barnard of the Merrimack County Sheriff's Office led the investigation in those first months, working out of a building on Route 9 with a caseboard that stayed on the wall through the fall and into the following winter. He was methodical, thorough in the way that detectives of that era were thorough. Working phones, working records, working the town itself. He knocked on a lot of doors in Belhaven that autumn. The early evidence pointed in several directions at once and resolved in none of them. The boot print was documented but never matched. The fiber sample was sent to a state lab and came back as consistent with a dark wool blend, common enough to eliminate nothing. The biological sample from the medical examiner's report was logged and sealed and entered into the evidence inventory with the rest of the case materials. Barnard developed a primary suspect within 3 weeks. A local man named Terrence Wills, 42 years old, who had a prior record for property offenses in Carroll County and had been seen by 2 separate witnesses near the school the week before the disappearance. Wills was questioned twice, gave inconsistent accounts of where he had been on the evening of October 14th, and was brought into the sheriff's office formally in November of that year. He was nervous. He revised his timeline twice. His explanation for the inconsistencies was not satisfying. but nothing physical connected him to the scene. No fiber match, no boot match, no biological link. By early 1984, Barnard had no basis to charge Terrence Wills, and the case had no other clear direction. Wills moved to Vermont in March of 1984. He died in Rutland County in 1999 of liver disease, never charged. The case against him unresolved and unprovable. What Barnard did not know, what he had no reason to look for because he had no reason to doubt the answer he received, was that one of the names on his initial employee contact list carried an alibi with a flaw in it. Harold Duffy, the school's part-time custodian, had told Barnard that he had spent the evening of October 14th at a deacons meeting at First Congregational Church. 3 of his fellow deacons confirmed this, placing the meeting's end time at approximately 8:30 p.m. Barnard noted the alibi. He moved on. He never formally requested the church secretary's meeting log. He had no reason to. Meanwhile, Philip Coburn sat in his hardware store on Route 3 and watched his town try to absorb what had happened. The way communities do in moments like this. Bellhaven came together initially. The vigil, the search volunteers, the casseroles on the Coburn porch. And then, the way communities also do, it slowly moved back toward itself. The school year continued. Christmas came. The new year arrived. The parking lot of Millbrook Elementary filled and emptied with the normal rhythms of the school day. And in room 14, a substitute teacher who did not yet know she would be there for years began to learn the names of 22 third graders who had lost their teacher and couldn't fully say why. The Merrimack County Sheriff's case file on the murder of Margaret Coburn remained officially open. Barnard worked it when new information came in. New information rarely came in. By 1986, the active investigation had slowed to near standstill. In 1994, a water pipe failure in the county records storage room destroyed a portion of the early case documentation, not the evidence itself, which was stored separately, but several of the early investigative logs and a set of witness interview transcripts. Some of what Barnard had built in those first months was gone. The case went cold. By 1988, 5 years had passed. The reward poster Carol Bertrand had put up in the window of the Bellhaven Diner had faded to the color of old paper, but nobody took it down. Philip had sold the hardware store and moved the boys to Manchester, where a new school could give them something that Bellhaven, for all its goodness, couldn't quite manage anymore. The house on Maple Court sat empty through one winter before a young family from Massachusetts bought it and repainted the shutters blue. By 1995, 12 years. Daniel graduated from UNH. He gave a commencement speech about teachers he had known. He kept a Polaroid of his mother in his wallet, her standing in the garden that last summer, laughing at something outside the frame. Wearing a green jacket he could still picture exactly. By 2004, 21 years. Philip Coburn died of cardiac arrest on a Wednesday morning in March. He was 59 years old. He had never stopped leaving the case number with any detective willing to take it. He left 2 grown sons and 4 grandchildren and a drawer in his kitchen desk that held, under the envelopes and rubber bands, a folded copy of the Merrimack County case summary. The teacher who had taken over Maggie's classroom in early 1984 kept a small framed photograph on the shelf above the supply closet for 22 years, until she herself retired. The children who passed through that room never knew whose face it was. The person who never gave up was Carol Bertrand, Maggie's younger sister, 61 years old in 2004 and living in Concord, who had spent every October since 1983 doing something with the case. She wrote letters to the cold case desk at the Merrimack County Sheriff's Office. She submitted the file to a national cold case volunteer organization in 2012 and again in 2016. She contacted regional news stations on the case's 30th anniversary in 2013 and its 40th in 2023. She kept a binder on her kitchen shelf. She never threw it away. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, cross-referencing records, and piecing together real lives that deserved far better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like the video and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Margaret Coburn. Then, in the spring of 2023, something arrived that no one in Belhaven had anticipated. The New Hampshire Attorney General's office announced funding for a statewide cold case DNA initiative, a program to systematically revisit biological evidence in unsolved homicide cases using forensic genealogy, the same technology that had identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 and had since been quietly solving cold cases across the country. Across Merrimack County, detectives began pulling files. A detective named Annette Prue opened a box she had been waiting years to open. The biological sample was 40 years old and perfectly preserved. Whatever the Merrimack County Sheriff's Office had failed to accomplish in the months and years after October 1983, the storage of that single piece of evidence had been done right. The DNA profile extracted from the sample remained viable and complete. Forensic genealogy works by uploading a crime scene DNA profile to public ancestry databases, the same websites where ordinary people trace their family histories, and systematically building family trees backward from the closest matches until they converge on a single unknown contributor. It is patient, careful work, and it is not fast. Detective Prue submitted the profile in August 2023. The first results came back as distant cousins, 4th and 5th degree, not sufficient on their own. Over the following months, her team built the family tree branch by branch, working through birth records and obituaries and publicly accessible genealogy data. Relatives in New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine. A branch that narrowed, then narrowed again. On a Tuesday morning in February 2024, Annette Prue was at her desk in the cold case unit when a name appeared on her screen that stopped her. She read it twice. She had grown up in Merrimack County. She knew this name. Everyone who had spent any time in Belhaven knew this name. She picked up the phone and called her supervisor. She didn't say hello first. "I need a warrant," she said, "for a cheek swab." 3 days later, the result came back. It was a match. Detective Prue drove to Concord that afternoon. She sat across a kitchen table from Carol Bertrand, who was 71 years old and had been waiting 41 years for a phone call she almost no longer let herself expect. Prue told her what they had found. Carol did not speak for almost a full minute. She looked out her kitchen window at the street. Then she said, quietly, "Can you say the name again?" Harold Duffy was 67 years old in the spring of 2024. He had never left Belhaven. He attended First Congregational Church on Sunday mornings, took his seat in the third pew from the front, and shook the pastor's hand in the narthex afterward. He had coached hundreds of boys through Little League from the same aluminum folding chair at Riverside Field for 30 years. He brought food to every family in town who had lost someone. People called him one of those people that hold a small town together. He had been the school custodian at Millbrook Elementary from 1979 to 1991. 12 years. He had buffed those hallways every week. He knew when staff members stayed late and when the building went quiet. He knew which parking lot was visible from Route 9 and which fire exit was not. In Detective Barnard's original 1983 investigation, Duffy had been noted briefly as a matter of standard procedure. He had been cooperative, mournful even. He had cried when speaking about the school, about the children, about what had happened. Investigators noted this as consistent with the genuine grief of a man who had worked in the building for 4 years. He had an alibi, the deacons' meeting at First Congregational, confirmed by 3 fellow deacons. Barnard checked it and moved on. What no one had checked, what no one had thought to request, was the First Congregational Church Secretary's meeting log for October 14, 1983. That log showed the deacons' meeting had concluded at 6:45 p.m., 90 minutes earlier than 3 men had stated. 3 men who were now all dead. A 90-minute window. That was what 41 years had been sitting inside. On the morning of April 9, 2024, Detective Prue and 2 Merrimack County deputies drove to Riverside Field, where Harold Duffy was setting up registration tables for Little League tryouts. The aluminum tables were half unfolded. A sign-up sheet lay on top, blank and waiting for the names of children. He saw them coming across the grass from the parking lot. He did not move. He looked at Detective Prue for a long moment and then looked down at the sign-up sheet on the table. She told him he was under arrest for the murder of Margaret Coburn. He said nothing. He did not deny it. By noon that day, the news had reached every corner of Bellhaven. A church secretary called 3 people. One of those 3 called the diner. By 2 o'clock, a cluster of people had gathered in the parking lot of First Congregational Church without being summoned. The way communities do when something they cannot explain has arrived. People who had known Harold Duffy for 40 years stood in that parking lot and tried to arrange 40 years of memory around a fact that did not fit. The man who brought casseroles, who coached their sons, who shook the pastor's hand after Sunday service, who had been in that school every week, who had been in that parking lot every week, who had stood at the vigil in 1983 and wept with the rest of them, hidden in plain sight. For 41 years, he was charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty at his arraignment. The forensic genealogy evidence, the DNA match, and the church secretary's meeting log correcting the original alibi were entered as evidence. His trial date was set for the following spring. As of this recording, the case is proceeding through the New Hampshire court system. Margaret Coburn was 34 years old on the last Friday of her life. She had stayed late because 3 of her students needed more time with their reading. She was 2 credits from a graduate degree she had built around the edges of motherhood and teaching and a full life. She grew tomatoes and left them on porches before the neighbors were awake. She made the leaf pile worth jumping into. She had plans for the following Tuesday's evening class. She had a list of children's chapter books she wanted to order for her classroom before Christmas. Her boys, Daniel and Christopher, are middle-aged men now, with children of their own. Daniel's daughter is 9 years old. Her name is Margaret. She goes by Maggie. Carol Bertrand, who spent 41 years making sure her sister's name stayed in the file and stayed in front of anyone who might do something with it, was 71 years old when Detective Prue sat down across her kitchen table. She has said in interviews since then that she does not feel relief, exactly. She feels that Maggie was always worth it, that the answer was always there, waiting to be found, that she would do every one of those years again. The case prompted the New Hampshire legislature to advance a measure updating evidence preservation and review standards for cold case biological samples across all counties in the state, requiring standardized storage protocols and mandatory periodic review against forensic genealogy databases. In discussion, it has been informally referred to as the Coburn Act. There is something in a case like this that is difficult to hold. The technology that identified Harold Duffy did not exist until recently. 10 years earlier, the evidence would have sat untouched for another decade. And it makes you ask a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. How many cases like this one are sitting in evidence lockers right now, waiting for a process that already exists to be applied to them. How many families have been told, carefully, that there is nothing more to be done when the answer is already preserved and waiting, and only requires the decision to look? Justice after 41 years is not quite the same thing as justice delivered on time. It is smaller and heavier and harder to hold. But it is still justice. And for the family that waited 4 decades, and for a woman whose name should never have needed a cold case detective to carry it this far, it matters that it came. 2 questions before you go. The same man who coached Little League for 30 years and brought food to grieving families is the man who did this. Does the 41-year gap between the crime and the arrest feel like justice to you? Or does it feel like something else? And what does a case like Margaret Coburn's tell us about the people communities decide to trust? Justice came for Margaret Coburn after 41 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are linked in the description below. Thank you for being here.